The humid air of Camp Pendleton hung heavy as evening approached. Staff Sergeant Marcus "Tank" Rodriguez wiped the sweat from his forehead as he finished securing the last of the equipment in the armory. His muscles ached from the day's intense training exercises, but he felt satisfied. Another successful day of whipping his Marines into shape. At 32, Tank had earned his nickname through sheer determination and an intimidating physical presence. Standing 6 feet 4 inches tall with shoulders that seemed to fill doorways, he commanded respect wherever he went. His dark hair was cropped military short, and his brown eyes held the intensity of someone who had seen combat and lived to tell about it. 2 tours in Afghanistan had shaped him into the kind of Marine that other Marines looked up to. Tank took pride in maintaining discipline. He believed that respect was earned through strength, and that the Marine Corps worked because everyone knew their place in the chain of command. He had little patience for what he saw as weakness or disrespect, especially from those he considered beneath his rank. As he locked up the armory, Tank noticed unusual activity near the main administration building. Several black SUVs were parked outside, their tinted windows reflecting the orange glow of the setting sun. Military police stood at attention near the entrance. Something important was happening, but Tank figured it was just another high-ranking visitor doing an inspection tour. Walking toward his barracks, Tank's attention was caught by a figure stumbling slightly near the edge of the parking lot. In the dim light, he could make out someone in civilian clothes who appeared to be having trouble walking straight. Tank's protective instincts kicked in immediately. Camp Pendleton was generally safe, but he had heard about incidents involving intoxicated personnel causing problems on base. The person was a woman, probably in her late 20s or early 30s, wearing jeans and a simple white blouse. Her dark hair was pulled back in a ponytail, and she seemed to be struggling with something heavy in her hands. As Tank got closer, he could see she was carrying what appeared to be a large duffel bag that kept slipping from her grip. Tank's first assumption was that this was either a dependent who had been drinking at one of the base social events, or possibly a civilian contractor who had overstayed her welcome at the officers' club. Either way, she clearly needed help, and Tank wasn't about to let someone wander around the base in what appeared to be an impaired state. "Ma'am," Tank called out, his voice carrying the authoritative tone he used when addressing subordinates. "Ma'am, you need to stop right there." The woman looked up, and Tank got his first clear look at her face. She was attractive, with intelligent green eyes and sharp features. But what struck him most was the slight confusion in her expression, as if she was trying to get her bearings. This only reinforced his belief that she had been drinking. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice carrying a slight accent he couldn't quite place. "Did you say something?" Tank approached her with the confidence of someone used to taking control of situations. "Ma'am, I'm Staff Sergeant Rodriguez. I need to ask if you've been drinking tonight." The woman set down her duffel bag and straightened up, which allowed Tank to see that she was taller than he had initially thought, probably around 5 feet 8 inches. "Excuse me," she said, her tone shifting slightly. "Ma'am, with all due respect, you appear to be intoxicated, and you're wandering around a military installation. I need to know if you've been drinking, and I need to see some identification." Tank moved closer as he spoke, using his physical presence to establish authority. This was a technique that had worked countless times before with unruly Marines and difficult civilians. Most people backed down when faced with his imposing figure and stern demeanor. But this woman didn't back down. Instead, she stood her ground and looked directly into his eyes. "Staff Sergeant, I think there's been a misunderstanding." "No ma'am, I don't think there has been," Tank replied firmly. "You're clearly impaired, you're carrying what appears to be personal belongings, and you're in an area where you probably shouldn't be without proper escort. I'm going to need you to come with me to the security office so we can sort this out." The woman glanced around, as if looking for something or someone. Tank interpreted this as the behavior of someone who was lost or confused due to intoxication. He had dealt with enough drunk Marines to recognize the signs. "Look," she said, turning back to Tank, "I appreciate your concern, but I assure you that I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. I just arrived on base, and I'm trying to find my quarters." Tank shook his head. "Ma'am, visiting quarters are in a completely different area of the base, and check-in closed hours ago." Whatever you're looking for, you're in the wrong place. He gestured toward the administrative building. Now, I'm going to ask you one more time to come with me voluntarily. If you refuse, I'm going to have to insist. The woman's expression hardened slightly. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, I believe you said? What unit are you with? Tank found her question odd but answered anyway. 2nd Battalion, 1st Marines, ma'am. And, right now, I'm concerned about base security and your welfare. I see, she said quietly. And, you've decided that I'm drunk and lost based on what exactly? Tank's patience was beginning to wear thin. He had given her multiple opportunities to cooperate, and she was continuing to argue with him. This was exactly the kind of disrespect that he couldn't tolerate, especially from a civilian on a military installation. Ma'am, based on the fact that you're stumbling around with a heavy bag, you appear confused about where you are, and you're arguing with a Marine Corps Staff Sergeant who's trying to help you. He stepped closer, using his height advantage to make his point clear. Now, I've been polite about this, but my patience is running out. You're going to come with me to security, or I'm going to call the MPs to escort you there. The woman looked up at Tank, and, for a moment, he thought he saw something like amusement in her eyes. This only irritated him further. Here he was, trying to help her and maintain base security, and she seemed to think something was funny. Staff Sergeant, she said slowly, before you make that call, perhaps you should ask yourself whether you might be making a mistake. Tank had heard enough. This civilian was now openly challenging his authority and refusing to cooperate. He had given her every opportunity to handle this the easy way, but she had chosen to be difficult. It was time to take control of the situation. Moving quickly, Tank stepped forward and placed his hand firmly on the woman's shoulder, using his other hand to guide her toward the wall of the nearest building. It wasn't violent, but it was definitely assertive. He had used this technique many times to control situations without having to resort to actual force. Ma'am, he said firmly, applying just enough pressure to make it clear that she wasn't going anywhere, you've had your chance to cooperate. Now you're going to stand right here while I call the MPs. With his free hand, Tank reached for his radio. As he did, he noticed that the woman didn't seem frightened or intimidated by his actions. Instead, she appeared to be waiting for something. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, she said calmly, despite being pinned against the wall, I think you should know that those MPs you're planning to call are probably looking for me right now. Tank paused, his finger hovering over his radio. What do you mean? I mean that I was supposed to meet with base security when I arrived, but my flight was delayed, and I've been trying to find the right building in the dark. Something in her tone made Tank hesitate. There was no fear in her voice, no anger at being physically restrained. Instead, she sounded almost patient, like someone waiting for a misunderstanding to be cleared up. Ma'am, if you were supposed to meet with base security, why didn't you say that in the first place? Because you never asked where I was going or why I was here, she replied. You just assumed I was drunk and decided that I needed to be controlled. Tank felt the first small doubt creeping into his mind. He had been so certain about what he was seeing that he hadn't really listened to what she was trying to tell him. But he had been a Marine for over a decade, and he trusted his instincts. Drunk civilians wandering around military bases was a real problem, and he had handled it correctly. Ma'am, even if that's true, it doesn't explain why you were stumbling or why you seemed confused. The woman gestured toward her duffel bag with her free arm. I've been traveling for 18 hours, I'm carrying about 40 pounds of gear, and I'm trying to read building numbers in the dark. I wasn't stumbling because I was drunk. I was tired and having trouble seeing where I was going. As she spoke, Tank became aware of approaching footsteps. Multiple people were walking quickly across the parking lot, and their voices carried a sense of urgency. Colonel Martinez, someone called out. Colonel, are you over there? Tank felt his blood freeze. Colonel? He looked down at the woman he had pinned against the wall, seeing her clearly for the first time. Without the assumption that she was an intoxicated civilian clouding his judgment, he began to notice details he had missed before. Her posture, even while being restrained, showed a confidence that came from years of command. her eyes held the steady gaze of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Most importantly, now that she was standing straight and alert, she had the unmistakable bearing of a military officer. "Over here," the woman called back calmly. "I'm fine." A group of Marines and MPs quickly approached, their faces showing concern that shifted to confusion when they saw the situation. A master sergeant that Tank recognized as part of the base command structure stepped forward. "Colonel Martinez," the master sergeant said, his voice careful and controlled, "is everything all right here?" Tank felt the world shift around him as the reality of what he had done began to sink in. Colonel Martinez. He had just physically restrained a full colonel in the United States Marine Corps. Not just any colonel, but apparently one important enough to have MPs looking for her and senior NCOs escorting her around the base. "Everything's fine, Master Sergeant Collins," Colonel Martinez replied, still completely calm. "Staff Sergeant Rodriguez here was concerned about base security. He thought I might be an intoxicated civilian who needed assistance." Tank's hand fell away from her shoulder as if he had been burned. He stepped back, his mind racing as he tried to process what had just happened. He had committed what might be the biggest mistake of his military career, and he had done it with absolute confidence that he was doing the right thing. Master Sergeant Collins looked between Tank and the colonel, clearly trying to understand the situation. "Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, you're from 2nd Battalion, correct?" "Yes, Master Sergeant," Tank replied, his voice barely above a whisper. All of his earlier confidence had evaporated, replaced by a growing sense of dread. Colonel Martinez picked up her duffel bag and brushed off her clothes. "Master Sergeant Collins, I believe Staff Sergeant Rodriguez was acting according to his understanding of the situation. No harm was done." But Tank knew that significant harm had been done, even if not physical. He had just manhandled a colonel based on assumptions and prejudice. He had seen a woman in civilian clothes and immediately assumed she was drunk and lost. He had used his physical size to intimidate and control her without giving her a real chance to explain herself. "Colonel," Tank said, finding his voice, I need to apologize. I made a serious error in judgment." Colonel Martinez looked at him steadily. "Staff Sergeant, we'll have time to discuss this later. Right now, I need to get checked in and briefed on my new command." New command. Tank's stomach dropped even further. This wasn't just any colonel who happened to be passing through. This was someone who was taking command of a unit on the base. Potentially his unit. Master Sergeant Collins gestured toward the administration building. "Colonel, if you'll come with us, we can get your check-in completed and get you settled in your quarters." As the group began to move away, Colonel Martinez paused and looked back at Tank. "Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, report to my office at 0800 tomorrow morning." "Yes, ma'am," Tank replied automatically, though the words felt strange in his mouth. As he watched them walk away, Tank stood alone in the parking lot, trying to comprehend what had just happened. In the span of 10 minutes, he had gone from being a confident staff sergeant maintaining base security to a Marine who had potentially ended his career by assaulting his new commanding officer. The humid air that had felt refreshing earlier now seemed oppressive. Tank looked around the base that had been his home for the past 3 years, wondering if he would still be here next week. He had always prided himself on his quick decision-making and his ability to take charge of difficult situations. But, tonight, those same qualities had led him into the biggest mistake of his life. As he finally walked toward his barracks, Tank's mind was already racing ahead to tomorrow morning. He would have to face Colonel Martinez and account for his actions. He would have to explain how a Marine with over a decade of experience could make such a fundamental error in judgment. But, even as he dreaded the coming confrontation, Tank couldn't shake the memory of how Colonel Martinez had handled the situation. She had remained calm under pressure, had given him opportunities to correct his mistake, and had ultimately defused the situation without causing additional drama. Those were the qualities of a real leader, and Tank was beginning to realize that he had a lot to learn about what leadership actually meant. The lights in his barracks seemed harsher than usual as Tank prepared for what might be his last night as a Marine staff sergeant. Tomorrow would bring consequences that he couldn't yet fully imagine, but he knew that his life in the Corps was about to change dramatically. The question was whether he would survive the change with his career intact. Tank barely slept that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Colonel Martinez's face as he pinned her against the wall. He replayed the encounter over and over, each time finding new ways he could have handled the situation better. By 0500, he gave up on sleep entirely and began preparing for what might be the most important meeting of his military career. He showered with extra care, ensuring his uniform was perfectly pressed and his boots gleamed with mirror-like precision. If he was going down, he would go down looking like the Marine he had always tried to be. His reflection in the mirror showed a man who had aged years in a single night. The confidence that had always been his trademark was nowhere to be seen, replaced by uncertainty and genuine fear. At 0730, Tank made his way across the base toward the administration building where Colonel Martinez had established her temporary office. The morning was already warm, but Tank felt cold inside. Other Marines he passed gave him curious looks, and he wondered how quickly word of his encounter with the new colonel had spread through the base grapevine. Master Sergeant Collins was waiting outside the colonel's office when Tank arrived. The older NCO's expression was neutral, but Tank could see the concern in his eyes. "Staff Sergeant Rodriguez," Collins said quietly, "the colonel wants to see you, but first, I think you should know a few things about who you're dealing with." Tank straightened up. "Yes, Master Sergeant." Colonel Sarah Martinez graduated from the Naval Academy 15 years ago. She served 3 combat tours, commanded a company in Afghanistan, and earned a Bronze Star for her actions under fire. She's also got a master's degree in military science and has been specifically selected to take command of 2nd Battalion. The weight of Collins' words settled on Tank's shoulders like a physical burden. He had not just confronted any colonel, he had manhandled one of the Marine Corps' rising stars. More importantly, Collins continued, she's got a reputation for being fair but demanding. She expects excellence from her Marines, but she also takes care of them. What happened last night was a serious mistake, but it's not necessarily the end of your career if you handle this right. What do you mean, Master Sergeant? I mean, you need to own up to what you did wrong, show that you understand why it was wrong, and demonstrate that you're capable of learning from this mistake. The colonel could have you court-martialed for what happened last night, but I don't think that's her intention. Tank nodded, trying to absorb the advice. How do you know, Master Sergeant? Collins smiled grimly. Because if she wanted you destroyed, you would have been arrested last night instead of being told to report this morning. She's giving you a chance to make this right, Staff Sergeant. Don't waste it. At exactly 0800, Collins knocked on the colonel's door and announced Tank's arrival. Colonel Martinez's voice called for him to enter, and Tank stepped into the office that would serve as her command center for the foreseeable future. The office was spartanly furnished but efficiently organized. Colonel Martinez sat behind a standard military desk, wearing her service uniform with perfect precision. In the bright fluorescent lighting, Tank could see her clearly for the first time. She was younger than he had expected, probably in her mid-30s, but her bearing conveyed the authority of someone much older and more experienced. "Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, please have a seat," she said, gesturing to the chair across from her desk. Tank sat ramrod straight, his hands positioned precisely on his knees. "Thank you, ma'am." Colonel Martinez studied him for a moment before speaking. "Staff Sergeant, I've reviewed your service record this morning. 12 years in the Corps, 2 combat tours, multiple commendations for leadership and bravery. You're clearly a good Marine with a strong record of service." "Thank you, ma'am." "Which makes what happened last night even more puzzling," she continued. "Can you explain to me how an experienced Marine Staff Sergeant ended up physically restraining his commanding officer based on the assumption that she was an intoxicated civilian?" Tank had prepared for this question, but hearing it asked directly still hit him like a physical blow. "Ma'am, there's no excuse for my actions last night. I made assumptions based on incomplete information, and I acted on those assumptions without giving you the opportunity to explain the situation." "That's a start," Colonel Martinez said. "But I need you to dig deeper than that. What specifically led you to make those assumptions?" Tank hesitated. This was the part he had dreaded most. being forced to examine his own prejudices and admit to them out loud. "Ma'am, I saw someone in civilian clothes who appeared to be having difficulty walking, and I immediately assumed that person was intoxicated. I didn't consider other possible explanations. Such as? Such as fatigue from travel, difficulty seeing in the dark, or someone carrying heavy equipment," Tank admitted. Colonel Martinez leaned back in her chair. "What else, Staff Sergeant?" Tank knew what she was getting at, but saying it out loud required more courage than charging an enemy position. "Ma'am, I think I also made assumptions based on the fact that you're a woman." "Explain that." "Ma'am, I think when I saw a woman in civilian clothes on a military base, I was more likely to assume she was a dependent or a civilian contractor rather than a Marine officer. If I had encountered a man in the same situation, I might have asked for identification before making assumptions about his condition or his right to be there." Colonel Martinez nodded slowly. "That's an honest assessment, Staff Sergeant. It's also deeply troubling." Tank felt sweat beading on his forehead despite the air conditioning. "Yes, ma'am." "Do you understand why it's troubling, Staff Sergeant?" "Ma'am, it suggests that I don't fully recognize or respect the authority of female officers. And if I have those kinds of unconscious biases, they could affect my ability to serve effectively under your command." Colonel Martinez stood and walked to the window that looked out over the base. "Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, I've been in the Marine Corps for 15 years. In that time, I've encountered every type of sexism and discrimination you can imagine. Some of it has been overt and malicious. Some of it has been unconscious and well-intentioned. What happened last night falls into the latter category." She turned back to face him. "The question is, what are we going to do about it?" Tank had expected punishment, perhaps even criminal charges. He hadn't expected to be asked for input on his own consequence. "Ma'am, I'm prepared to accept whatever punishment you deem appropriate." "That's not what I asked, Staff Sergeant. I asked what we're going to do about the underlying problem that led to this incident." Tank thought carefully before responding. "Ma'am, I think I need to examine my own unconscious biases and work to correct them. I also think I need to demonstrate through my actions that I can serve effectively under your command." "Better," Colonel Martinez said, returning to her seat. "But still not complete. This isn't just about you, Staff Sergeant. This is about the Marines under your leadership and the culture you're helping to create in your unit." The full weight of her words hit Tank like a sledgehammer. His attitudes and assumptions didn't exist in a vacuum. They influenced how he treated his subordinates, how he made decisions about their careers, and what kind of example he set for younger Marines. "Ma'am, you're right. If I have these kinds of unconscious biases, they're probably affecting how I lead my Marines, especially the female Marines in my unit." Colonel Martinez nodded. "Now you're beginning to understand the scope of the problem. This isn't just about one embarrassing encounter. This is about leadership, respect, and the kind of Marine Corps we want to build for the future." She opened a file on her desk and reviewed it briefly. "Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, I'm not going to pursue formal disciplinary action for what happened last night." Tank felt a wave of relief wash over him, but he remained alert. He sensed that there was more coming. "However," Colonel Martinez continued, "I am going to require several things from you. First, you will undergo sensitivity and bias training with the base Equal Opportunity Advisor. Second, you will work directly with me for the next 90 days as I assume command of 2nd Battalion. This will give me the opportunity to observe your leadership style and help you develop a better understanding of modern military leadership." "Yes, ma'am," Tank replied, though he wasn't entirely sure what working directly with the colonel would entail. "Third, you will mentor one of the junior female Marines in your unit, helping her develop her leadership skills and preparing her for promotion. This will give you hands-on experience in recognizing and developing the potential of all Marines, regardless of gender." Tank nodded. "Ma'am, may I ask which Marine you have in mind?" "Corporal Jennifer Walsh. She's been recommended for promotion to sergeant, but her previous leadership seems to have overlooked her potential. You'll be working with her to prepare her for a leadership position." Tank knew Corporal Walsh, though not well. She was competent and professional, but he had never really considered her for leadership positions. He was beginning to realize that this might be exactly the kind of oversight the colonel was talking about. "Yes, ma'am. I'll begin working with Corporal Walsh immediately." Colonel Martinez closed the file and looked directly at Tank. "Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, I want you to understand something. I'm not doing this to humiliate you or to prove a point. I'm doing this because I believe you have the potential to be a better leader than you were last night. The Marine Corps needs good leaders, and I think you can be one if you're willing to learn and grow." "Thank you, ma'am. I appreciate the opportunity." "Don't thank me yet, Staff Sergeant. The next 90 days are going to be challenging for both of us. You're going to be forced to examine assumptions and beliefs that you've probably never questioned before. You're going to have to admit when you're wrong and change behaviors that might feel natural to you." Tank straightened up. "Ma'am, I understand. I'm prepared to do whatever it takes." Colonel Martinez smiled for the first time since he had entered her office. "I hope so, Staff Sergeant. Because this battalion needs strong leaders who can recognize and develop the potential in all Marines, not just the ones who look like them or share their backgrounds." She stood, indicating that the formal part of their meeting was over. "Report back here at 1400 for your first working session. We're going to review the personnel files for your unit, and I want your honest assessment of each Marine's potential for advancement." "Yes, ma'am." As Tank rose to leave, Colonel Martinez spoke again. "Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, one more thing. What happened last night stays between us and the few people who were already involved. I don't want this incident to define your time under my command, and I don't want it to undermine your authority with your Marines. But I also need you to understand that this is your one chance to get this right." "I understand, ma'am. Thank you." Tank left the colonel's office feeling emotionally drained but oddly hopeful. He had expected to be destroyed by this meeting, but instead, he had been given an opportunity to become a better Marine and a better leader. It wouldn't be easy, but for the first time since the previous evening, Tank felt like his career might survive this mistake. As he walked back to his unit's area, Tank's mind was already working on how to approach Corporal Walsh and begin the process of mentoring her development. He also thought about the other Marines in his unit and began to question whether he had been giving all of them equal opportunities to prove themselves. The next 90 days would test Tank in ways that combat never had. He would have to confront his own limitations and biases while learning to serve under a commander who represented everything he thought he knew about military leadership but had never fully understood. But, as intimidating as the challenge ahead seemed, Tank felt something he hadn't experienced in years: excitement about learning something new. Colonel Martinez had shown him that true leadership wasn't about imposing your will through physical presence or force of personality. It was about recognizing potential, developing people, and creating an environment where everyone could excel. Tank had a lot to learn, and he was finally ready to start learning it. 3 weeks into his 90-day assignment with Colonel Martinez, Tank was discovering that everything he thought he knew about leadership was incomplete. Working directly with the colonel had opened his eyes to a completely different approach to command that was both more complex and more effective than anything he had experienced before. The morning briefings were particularly eye-opening. Where previous commanders had focused primarily on mission objectives and tactical concerns, Colonel Martinez consistently asked questions about personnel development, unit morale, and long-term strategic thinking. She wanted to know not just what her Marines were doing, but how they were developing as individuals and leaders. Tank sat in the colonel's office, reviewing the monthly training schedule they had been developing together. The document represented weeks of collaboration, and Tank was surprised by how much his input was valued and incorporated into the final plan. "Staff Sergeant," Colonel Martinez said, looking up from her computer, "I want to discuss your progress with Corporal Walsh." Tank had been dreading this conversation, though for different reasons than he might have expected a month ago. His work with Corporal Walsh had been both challenging and revealing, forcing him to confront assumptions he hadn't even realized he was making. "Ma'am, I have to admit that my initial assessment of Corporal Walsh was completely wrong." Colonel Martinez raised an eyebrow. "How so?" Tank chose his words carefully. Ma'am, when you first assigned me to mentor her, I thought it would be a matter of helping her improve basic leadership skills that I assumed she was lacking. What I discovered is that she already possessed most of the qualities of an effective leader. I had just never bothered to look for them. Give me specifics, Staff Sergeant. Tank opened his notebook, where he had been documenting his observations over the past 3 weeks. Ma'am, Corporal Walsh has consistently demonstrated tactical competence, physical fitness, and technical knowledge that exceeds many of her peers. More importantly, she has natural communication skills and emotional intelligence that I had completely overlooked. Colonel Martinez leaned back in her chair. What do you think caused you to overlook those qualities? This was the question Tank had been wrestling with for days. Ma'am, I think I was looking for leadership qualities that matched my own style. I was expecting to see aggressive, direct, physically imposing behavior. When I didn't see that, I assumed she lacked leadership potential. And, now? Now I understand that effective leadership comes in many different forms. Corporal Walsh leads through competence, communication, and building consensus. She gets the same results I do, but she does it without intimidation or force of personality. Tank paused, then continued with something that had been bothering him for days. Ma'am, I also realized that some of the behaviors I interpreted as lack of assertiveness were actually Corporal Walsh being careful not to overstep boundaries in a male-dominated environment. She was demonstrating good judgment, not weakness. Colonel Martinez nodded approvingly. That's an important distinction, Staff Sergeant. What else have you learned? Tank flipped through his notes, finding the observations that had surprised him most. Ma'am, I've been watching how the other Marines interact with Corporal Walsh during training exercises. They trust her judgment, they listen when she speaks, and they follow her lead naturally. She's already functioning as a leader, she just hasn't been given the official recognition or opportunities. Have you discussed promotion preparation with her? Yes, ma'am. We've been working on formal leadership skills to complement her natural abilities. She's been studying military history, working on briefing techniques, and preparing for the written examination for sergeant. Tank hesitated before continuing. Ma'am, I also learned something important about my own leadership style through this process. Go on. I realized that I've been using my physical presence and aggressive personality to mask some fundamental gaps in my leadership knowledge. Corporal Walsh forced me to think about how to motivate and develop people without relying on intimidation. Colonel Martinez smiled. That's exactly the kind of insight I was hoping you would gain from this experience. How has this changed your approach with your other Marines? Tank thought about the past few weeks with his unit. Ma'am, I've started paying more attention to the individual strengths and development needs of each Marine. I've also started asking for their input on decisions instead of just giving orders and expecting compliance. And the results? Better performance, better morale, and better cohesion within the unit. I'm actually getting more out of my Marines by treating them as individuals rather than interchangeable parts. Colonel Martinez opened her own notebook and reviewed several pages of notes. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, your direct supervisor has reported significant improvements in your unit's performance over the past month. More importantly, several Marines in your unit have specifically mentioned positive changes in your leadership approach. Tank felt a surge of pride but tried to remain professional. Thank you, ma'am. Don't thank me yet, Colonel Martinez said with a slight smile. We're not finished with your development. I want to discuss the next phase of your assignment. She handed Tank a folder containing what appeared to be a complex training scenario. The battalion is going to participate in a major joint training exercise next month. I want you to serve as my liaison with the other service components involved in the exercise. Tank reviewed the documents quickly. The exercise involved Marines, Army units, Navy personnel, and Air Force support. It would be a complex logistical and coordination challenge. Ma'am, I appreciate the opportunity, but I'm not sure I'm qualified for this kind of inter-service coordination. Colonel Martinez leaned forward. Staff Sergeant, you're more qualified than you think. But, more importantly, this assignment will challenge you to work with leaders from different backgrounds and different service cultures. You'll have to communicate effectively, build relationships, and solve problems collaboratively. Tank began to understand the purpose of the assignment. Ma'am, this is about learning to work with people who don't share my background or approach to leadership. Exactly. You've made significant progress in understanding how to work with different types of Marines. Now I want to see if you can apply those lessons to working with Army captains, Navy chiefs, and Air Force sergeants who all have different perspectives on how to accomplish the mission. She handed him another folder. You'll be working directly with Captain Lisa Chun from the Army, Chief Petty Officer Michael Thompson from the Navy, and Technical Sergeant Maria Rodriguez from the Air Force. Your job is to coordinate logistics, communications, and personnel movement for the entire exercise. Tank felt a familiar flutter of nervousness but recognized it now as excitement rather than anxiety. The old Tank would have been intimidated by the prospect of working with senior personnel from other services. The new Tank was curious about what he could learn from the experience. Ma'am, when do I start? Today. Captain Chen will be arriving this afternoon for preliminary planning. You'll be meeting with her at 1500 to begin developing the coordination framework. Colonel Martinez closed her folders and looked directly at Tank. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, I want you to understand something about this assignment. I'm not giving you this responsibility because I think you need to be tested further. I'm giving it to you because I believe you're ready for it. Tank straightened up. Thank you, ma'am. I won't let you down. I know you won't. But I also want you to remember the lessons you've learned over the past month. Leadership isn't about proving that you're the strongest or the most dominant person in the room. It's about bringing out the best in the people around you and finding ways to accomplish the mission together. She stood, indicating that their meeting was coming to an end. You've changed significantly over the past few weeks, Staff Sergeant. You're more thoughtful, more collaborative, and more effective as a leader. But the real test will be whether you can maintain these improvements when you're under pressure or working with difficult people. Tank rose and gathered his materials. Ma'am, I understand. I also want you to know how grateful I am for this opportunity. A month ago, I thought I was a good leader because I could make people follow orders. Now I'm beginning to understand what real leadership actually looks like. Colonel Martinez smiled. Staff Sergeant, you always had the potential to be an excellent leader. You just needed someone to help you see beyond the limitations you had placed on yourself. As Tank left the colonel's office, he reflected on how much his understanding of leadership had evolved. The Marine who had pinned a colonel against a wall 3 weeks ago had been confident but fundamentally limited in his approach. He had confused authority with leadership and had mistaken compliance for respect. The Marine walking across the base today was still confident, but in a completely different way. He was confident in his ability to learn, to grow, and to bring out the best in the people around him. He no longer needed to be the biggest or strongest person in the room to be effective. Tank's first meeting with Captain Chen would be a test of everything he had learned. Army officers had different training, different priorities, and different approaches to problem solving than Marines. The old Tank would have tried to establish dominance and impose his will on the planning process. The new Tank was genuinely curious about what perspective Captain Chen would bring to the exercise and how her ideas might improve the overall plan. As he prepared for the meeting, Tank thought about Corporal Walsh and the other Marines he was learning to lead differently. He had always thought that respect was something that had to be demanded or enforced. Now he was discovering that real respect was something that had to be earned through competence, fairness, and genuine concern for the people under his command. The next month would bring new challenges and new opportunities to apply the lessons he had learned. Tank was ready for those challenges in a way that he never had been before. He finally understood that true leadership wasn't about controlling people, it was about empowering them to accomplish things they never thought they could do. Colonel Martinez had given him much more than a chance to salvage his career. She had given him the opportunity to become the kind of leader the Marine Corps needed for the future, and Tank was determined to prove himself worthy of that opportunity. 2 months after his life-changing encounter with Colonel Martinez, Tank stood before a formation of Marines as the battalion prepared for the culmination of their joint training exercise. The morning sun cast long shadows across Camp Pendleton as he looked out at the faces of the men and women he had learned to lead in an entirely new way. The joint exercise had been a complete success, exceeding all expectations and earning praise from senior commanders across all service branches. But, for Tank, the real victory was much more personal. He had discovered what it meant to be the kind of leader he had always aspired to be but had never fully understood how to become. Captain Lisa Chen stood beside him, reviewing the final after-action reports from their coordination efforts. Over the past month, they had developed a working relationship that combined the best aspects of Marine efficiency with Army thoroughness. Tank had learned to value her methodical approach to planning, while she had appreciated his ability to adapt quickly when situations changed. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, Captain Chen said, closing her folder, I have to admit that when I first heard I would be working with a Marine NCO on this exercise, I had some concerns about whether we would be able to collaborate effectively. Tank smiled, remembering his own initial anxieties about working with Army personnel. Ma'am, I think we both discovered that good leadership transcends service boundaries. More than that, she replied. You taught me some things about flexibility and decision-making under pressure that I'm going to take back to my own unit. This has been one of the most productive joint operations I've participated in. Chief Petty Officer Thompson approached them, carrying the final logistics reports. The Navy chief had become an invaluable part of their coordination team, bringing a perspective on naval operations that had enhanced the entire exercise. Staff Sergeant, Thompson said, I wanted to thank you for the way you handled that supply crisis last week. When our equipment shipment got delayed, you found a solution that kept the entire exercise on track without compromising any service's training objectives. Tank reflected on that incident. The old Tank would have tried to solve the problem through sheer force of will, probably creating conflict with the other services in the process. Instead, he had brought all the coordinators together, listened to everyone's concerns and constraints, and developed a collaborative solution that actually improved the original plan. Chief, that was a team effort. We succeeded because everyone was willing to be flexible and put the mission ahead of individual service interests. Technical Sergeant Rodriguez from the Air Force joined their group, completing the coordination team that had made the exercise such a success. I've been in the Air Force for 14 years, she said, and this is the first joint exercise where I actually felt like all the services were working together instead of just operating in parallel. Tank looked at the three senior NCOs who had become not just colleagues but genuine mentors over the past month. Each had taught him something different about leadership, and he had tried to share his own insights in return. As they completed their final coordination tasks, Tank saw Colonel Martinez approaching across the field. She had been observing the exercise from various command positions, evaluating both the tactical success and the leadership development of her key personnel. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, Colonel Martinez said as she joined the group, I understand that the joint coordination has been exceptionally successful. Yes, ma'am, Tank replied. We've exceeded all our coordination benchmarks, and feedback from all service components has been overwhelmingly positive. Colonel Martinez turned to address the entire coordination team. Captain Chen, Chief Thompson, Technical Sergeant Rodriguez, I want to thank you for your collaboration with our Marines during this exercise. Your professionalism and expertise have contributed significantly to our success. After the other service members departed to rejoin their respective units, Colonel Martinez and Tank walked together toward the battalion command post. The exercise was officially concluding, which meant Tank's special assignment was also coming to an end. Staff Sergeant, Colonel Martinez began, it's time for us to discuss your permanent assignment going forward. Tank had been wondering about this conversation for weeks. His 90-day assignment had been extended to cover the joint exercise, but he knew that eventually he would need to return to normal duties within the battalion. Ma'am, I'm prepared to return to my previous position with 2nd Battalion. Colonel Martinez stopped walking and turned to face him. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, you're not returning to your previous position. You've outgrown that assignment. Tank felt a flutter of uncertainty. Ma'am? I'm recommending you for promotion to gunnery sergeant, and I'm assigning you as the battalion's senior enlisted advisor for joint operations and leadership development. The words hit Tank like a physical blow. Promotion to gunnery sergeant represented a major advancement in his career, and the assignment described was far beyond anything he had imagined possible just 3 months earlier. Ma'am, I'm honored, but I'm not sure I'm qualified for that level of responsibility. Colonel Martinez smiled. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, 3 months ago you weren't qualified for that responsibility. Today, you are. You've demonstrated the ability to learn, grow, and adapt your leadership style to meet new challenges. More importantly, you've shown that you can help other leaders develop those same capabilities. They resumed walking as Colonel Martinez continued. The Marine Corps is changing, Staff Sergeant. We need leaders who can work effectively in joint environments, who can develop the potential of all Marines regardless of background, and who can adapt to complex challenges that require collaboration rather than dominance. Tank thought about Corporal Walsh, who had been promoted to sergeant the previous week and was already excelling in her new leadership role. He thought about the other Marines in his unit who had flourished under his new approach to leadership. He thought about the successful collaboration with personnel from other services. Ma'am, I understand the responsibility you're offering me, and I accept it. But I also want you to know that the person who can handle this assignment is not the same person who pinned you against a wall 3 months ago. Colonel Martinez nodded. That's exactly why I'm confident in this decision. The Marine who made that mistake was operating from assumptions and limitations that he had never examined. The Marine standing here today has learned to question his assumptions, acknowledge his limitations, and grow beyond them. They reached the command post, where the final exercise briefings were taking place. Tank could see Marines from his unit preparing equipment and coordinating with personnel from other services. The level of cooperation and mutual respect was obvious, and Tank felt a surge of pride in what they had all accomplished together. Ma'am, Tank said, I want to ask you something that I've been thinking about since this all started. Go ahead, Staff Sergeant. When you decided not to pursue disciplinary action against me that first morning, you said you thought I had the potential to become a better leader. How could you have known that? I had just physically restrained you based on completely wrong assumptions. Colonel Martinez was quiet for a moment, considering her answer. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, I'd been in situations where people made assumptions about me based on my gender, my appearance, or their own limited perspectives. Some of those people were malicious, but most were simply operating from incomplete understanding. She gestured toward the Marines working around them. The difference between someone who can learn and someone who can't isn't whether they make mistakes. It's how they respond when their mistakes are pointed out to them. You could have become defensive, blamed external factors, or insisted that you were right despite evidence to the contrary. Tank remembered that first meeting in her office, when she had forced him to examine his own biases and assumptions. It had been uncomfortable but necessary. Instead, Colonel Martinez continued, you took responsibility for your actions, you demonstrated genuine desire to understand what you had done wrong, and you showed willingness to change behaviors that weren't serving you well. Those are the qualities of someone who can become an exceptional leader. Tank looked around at the Marines under his influence and thought about the journey that had brought him to this point. 3 months ago, he had thought leadership was about being the strongest person in the room. Now he understood that real leadership was about making everyone in the room stronger. Ma'am, there's one more thing I want you to know. What's that, Staff Sergeant? I've learned more about leadership in the past 3 months than I learned in the previous 12 years of my career. But, more than that, I've learned to appreciate the kind of leader you are. You could have destroyed my career that night, but instead you chose to invest in my potential. That's the kind of leader I want to be for the Marines under my command. Colonel Martinez extended her hand for a handshake. Gunnery Sergeant Rodriguez, I look forward to seeing what you accomplish in your new assignment. As Tank shook his new commanding officer's hand, he reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought him to this moment. A mistake that could have ended his career had instead become the catalyst for the most important period of growth and development in his life. The Marines around him were preparing for the next phase of their training and development. Tank was ready to help lead that process, armed with a completely new understanding of what effective leadership actually meant. He had learned to see beyond his own assumptions, to value diverse perspectives and approaches, and to bring out the best in everyone around him. Most importantly, Tank had learned that true strength came not from imposing your will on others, but from empowering them to achieve things they never thought possible. Colonel Martinez had shown him that example, and now he was ready to pass those lessons on to the next generation of Marine leaders. As the sun set over Camp Pendleton, Tank looked forward to the challenges and opportunities that lay ahead. He was no longer the Marine who had made assumptions about a woman in civilian clothes. He was a leader who understood that his job was to recognize potential wherever it existed and help it flourish. That was a responsibility he was finally ready to embrace with the confidence of someone who had learned to lead through service rather than dominance. The transformation was complete, but the journey of leadership development would continue for the rest of his career. Tank was ready for that journey, equipped with wisdom earned through failure, growth, and the guidance of a leader who had seen his potential when he couldn't see it himself.